The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered. The air was thick with anticipation, and all eyes were on the woman sitting at the defendant's table. Ava Sterling. She was the billionaire heiress to one of the largest fashion empires in the world. Ava sat back in her chair with an air of smug superiority, her designer suit immaculate, arms crossed over her chest, lips curled into a smirk. Across from her, sitting with a tense posture, was Jason Adams, the man who had suffered so much because of her reckless actions. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, knuckles white with anger and pain, his eyes filled with both defiance and desperation. Ava chuckled softly to herself and shook her head, her gaze flicking to Jason. "Oh, come on. You're acting like I ruined your life. You're exaggerating." She turned to the judge, a dismissive roll of her eyes betraying her boredom. "Your Honor, people like him always blow things out of proportion." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the onlookers exchanged shocked glances. Jason's lawyer clenched his jaw, his hands trembling with barely contained frustration. Judge Thompson, a man in his late 50s with piercing blue eyes, leaned forward, his expression calm yet calculating. He cleared his throat and set his gavel down with a controlled motion. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice even but firm, "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, because in a moment I'm going to say something that could change your life forever." Ava's smirk faltered, the room holding its collective breath. Jason's heart raced as he watched the once untouchable heiress begin to unravel. For the first time, she was no longer in control. The judge let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. 2 months ago, a different scene unfolded on the streets of New York City. It was a sunny afternoon in Manhattan, the streets alive with the sound of people rushing through their busy lives. Among the bustling crowd was Jason Adams, a man who had made a life out of hard work and sacrifice. A mechanic by day and a rideshare driver by night, Jason balanced the weight of 2 jobs to provide for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Life wasn't easy, but he did everything he could to make her smile. Jason loved his daughter more than anything in the world. When he came home from his long shifts, exhausted and drained, Lily's infectious hug made it all worth it. It reminded him why he fought so hard every single day. One evening, after another grueling shift at the auto repair shop, Jason received a rideshare request from a luxury hotel. When he arrived, a tall woman dressed in an elegant black dress strutted toward his car with a sense of purpose. Ava Sterling. Jason had seen her name in the tabloids countless times. She was a household name, the heir to one of the most influential fashion brands in the world. Cameras followed her everywhere, and tonight was no different. Paparazzi surrounded her as she climbed into the back seat of Jason's car. "Drive fast," Ava ordered curtly, not even glancing at him as she slid into the seat. Jason glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" Ava sighed dramatically, her voice dripping with condescension. "I put the address in the app. Do I really need to repeat myself?" Jason clenched his jaw and turned his attention back to the road. He had dealt with rude passengers before, but something about her arrogance made his blood boil. He focused on driving, trying to ignore her dismissive attitude. Minutes later, as they cruised through the city, a car swerved into their lane at breakneck speed. Jason's heart stopped as he slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact was deafening, sending his car spinning uncontrollably into the intersection. Everything around him became a blur of motion and sound, the world spiraling out of control. When he regained consciousness, Jason could hear the wail of sirens. His head throbbed, and pain shot through his body as paramedics rushed to his side, pulling him from the wreckage. But despite the pain, the only thing on his mind was Lily. The world around him became a haze as he tried to move, only to be overwhelmed by the sharp pain in his leg. That's when he saw Ava standing nearby, seemingly unfazed by the disaster that had just occurred. Her phone was in her hand as she scrolled absent-mindedly, her dress still pristine despite the chaos. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, brushing off her dress as if the accident were little more than an inconvenience. Jason groaned as the paramedics moved him onto a stretcher, his vision blurry from the pain. He turned to Ava, hoping for at least a sign of concern, but all he received was a cold scoff. "Great," Ava said, rolling her eyes. "Now I'm going to be late." She turned away, making a call. "Get me another car. I'm not dealing with this nonsense." Jason's heart sank. She didn't care about him. To her, he was just another insignificant person who had disrupted her perfect life. That night, in the hospital, the news was devastating. Jason's leg was severely fractured, and he was told that he would be out of work for months. The mechanic and rideshare driver who had once worked tirelessly to provide for his daughter now had no means of earning an income. All the bills began piling up, and his savings were quickly draining. Meanwhile, Ava's life continued without a hitch. She spent her days attending fashion shows, vacationing on private islands, and hosting lavish parties. Jason, however, had to find a way to make ends meet, watching his savings dry up while Ava continued to live in a bubble, untouched by the consequences of her actions. In the weeks that followed, Jason's frustration grew. When his lawyer uncovered that Ava had refused to testify, ignored police calls, and even attempted to bribe hospital staff to cover up the incident, Jason knew he had no choice but to take a stand. He filed a lawsuit. The trial had started, and Ava Sterling, with all her wealth and influence, assumed it would be just another minor inconvenience, a mere blip in the grand scheme of her life. She sat confidently in the courtroom, a picture of calm, as if the proceedings were little more than a formality. Jason, on the other hand, sat across from her, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. His leg was still healing, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll that the accident had taken on him. It had been a long road of recovery, one filled with hospital visits, physical therapy, and constant reminders that his life would never be the same. His injuries had forced him to sell his car, his only source of income, and now he was struggling to make ends meet. But the worst part? Ava Hart, the woman who had caused the accident, had never even checked to see if he was okay. Not once. Jason's lawyer, Gregory Miller, stood beside him, presenting evidence of Ava's refusal to testify, her lack of cooperation with the police, and her attempts to buy off hospital staff. The courtroom was filled with murmurs of disbelief. It was clear to everyone that Ava's wealth and status had protected her, but Jason was determined to hold her accountable. He refused to let her off the hook for the destruction she had caused in his life. Ava, however, remained unfazed. She seemed to think that with enough money and influence, she could easily escape the consequences of her actions. As the lawyer spoke, Ava leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest, a bored expression on her face. She glanced around the courtroom, eyes flicking from one person to the next, as if she had better things to do than sit through this trial. "Your Honor," she interjected, her voice dripping with arrogance, "I don't think I need to be here. This is all just a misunderstanding. I wasn't at fault. Accidents happen all the time. And now, it seems like people just want to take advantage of my success." Her words rang out in the courtroom, causing a ripple of disbelief. Jason's lawyer's face hardened, his patience worn thin. "You believe this is just an accident?" Gregory asked, his voice growing sharp. "You think your wealth and privilege can shield you from the truth? That you can just dismiss the harm you've caused to another person because you're too rich to care?" Ava opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sound of Judge Thompson's gavel. "Miss Sterling," he said firmly, his voice a warning, "I suggest you control your tone. This court will not tolerate your disrespect." Ava's smirk faltered, but she quickly regained her composure, turning her gaze back to Jason. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by her usual disdain. The aftermath for Jason Weeks passed, and Jason's situation only grew more dire. Without the ability to work as a mechanic or a rideshare driver, he struggled to put food on the table for Lily, his 8-year-old daughter. The once bright, carefree little girl now carried the weight of her father's pain on her shoulders. She saw him trying to mask his exhaustion and frustration, but she knew something was wrong. Every time Jason looked at his daughter, he was reminded of why he kept going. Lily deserved a better life than the one they were living now. He couldn't let her see him fall apart, so he forced a smile and did his best to keep things as normal as possible for her. But deep down, he felt like he was losing everything. Ava, on the other hand, continued to live her life untouched by the wreckage she had left behind. She appeared at fashion shows, posted pictures of her lavish vacations on social media, and went about her day-to-day activities as if nothing had changed. She was still the same cold, untouchable woman who thought the world revolved around her. For weeks, Jason heard nothing from her, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, nothing but the silence of a woman who thought she was above it all. And then came the lawsuit. Jason never intended to go to court. He wasn't a fighter. Not like this. But when his lawyer, Gregory, told him about Ava's attempts to cover everything up, about how she had even tried to silence the hospital staff with hush money, Jason knew he had no choice. His family, his life, his future were all at stake. When the lawsuit was filed, Ava laughed it off, thinking it was just another meaningless attempt to bring her down. She couldn't fathom that someone like her, someone who had everything, could be held accountable for anything. She believed her money could make all problems disappear. But as the trial began, Ava realized she had underestimated the power of the people she had wronged. Ava's realization. On the morning of the trial, Ava entered the courtroom with the same sense of superiority that she always carried. She wore a sleek black dress and a pair of designer heels, her hair perfectly styled. She was used to being in control, to having everyone bow down to her. In her world, money solved everything, and she had enough of it to avoid the consequences of her actions. Or so she thought. As the trial unfolded, Ava's bravado began to crack. Jason's lawyer, Gregory, was relentless in his pursuit of the truth. He laid out all the evidence, the police reports, the testimonies, the medical records, and showed the court just how far Ava had gone to evade responsibility. He painted a clear picture of a woman who believed that her wealth could buy her way out of any situation. And then came the moment that made Ava's blood run cold. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Sterling, I've seen many people like you, people who think their wealth makes them untouchable. But today, you will learn that no amount of money can buy your way out of the consequences of your actions." Ava's smirk faltered as the words hit her like a slap. For the first time, she felt a flicker of fear. She looked around the courtroom, realizing that the people she had once looked down on were now holding her accountable. The judge took a deep breath before speaking again. "Miss Sterling, I am placing an immediate freeze on all of your assets until this case is resolved. If you think you can simply walk away from this without facing the consequences, you are mistaken. You will be held accountable for your actions in ways you never expected." The courtroom erupted in shock. Ava's face drained of color. She stood up, her voice shaking. "You can't do this," she protested. "I have businesses to run, properties to manage, investments to protect. You have no right to do this to me." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "This is not about what you own. This is about what you lack: empathy, responsibility, and basic human decency." Ava's legs trembled as she slowly sat back down. Her world was starting to crumble, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how to stop it. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Ava Sterling, the heiress to a multi-billion-dollar fashion empire, sat with her arms crossed tightly in front of her. The sharp, measured glances of the judge and the firm, unwavering presence of Jason Adams's lawyer sent a clear message. Things were no longer in her control. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but there was no escaping the truth now. Her wealth, her status, her connections, none of them could save her in this moment. Ava had always believed that money could shield her from the consequences of her actions, but this time, the walls she had so carefully built around herself were beginning to crack. Jason's lawyer, Gregory Miller, stood tall, ready to dismantle Ava's defenses piece by piece. He had painstakingly gathered evidence, from police reports to hospital records, every detail that painted a clear picture of Ava's negligence and deliberate attempt to cover up the accident that had irrevocably changed Jason's life. "You see, Your Honor," Gregory began, his voice calm but filled with conviction, "Miss Sterling is not a victim here. She is a perpetrator. She caused this accident through reckless behavior, and instead of showing any remorse, she chose to use her wealth to escape accountability. She ignored the police, refused to testify, and even tried to bribe hospital staff to keep quiet about the extent of her involvement." Ava sat back in her seat, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. It wasn't a shock to her. She had dealt with lawyers like Gregory before, people who had tried to take her down for one reason or another. She was used to silencing them with a check, and she had fully expected this to be no different. The idea that Jason, a mechanic who lived paycheck to paycheck, would dare to stand up to her felt absurd. He wasn't her equal. He was just an obstacle. She could feel her anger rising. How dare he try to drag her down into his mess? Judge Thompson, who had been listening intently, glanced over at Ava. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through her. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice cold and authoritative, "do you have anything to say for yourself? Or will you continue to pretend that this is just a minor inconvenience?" Ava's lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've already said everything that needs to be said, Your Honor. This is all an overreaction. I didn't cause this accident on purpose. Accidents happen, and people like Mr. Adams exaggerate." A low murmur spread through the courtroom, and Jason's lawyer looked as if he might explode with frustration. "Your Honor," Gregory said, raising his voice, "it's not just an accident. It's a pattern of reckless behavior, and Miss Sterling has shown absolutely no accountability for her actions. And what's worse, she's refused to show any empathy for the man she injured. She never even bothered to check if he was okay after the crash." Ava's face remained stoic, but something in her expression flickered. She was starting to feel it. The walls were crumbling. Jason's mind raced, his hands shaking as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. For weeks, he had been waiting for this moment, for someone, anyone, to hold Ava accountable. But now that it was here, the weight of it hit him all at once. The anger, the pain, the frustration, it was all there, boiling inside him. This was the moment where his life would either be destroyed further, or he would finally have a chance at justice. And then, as if on cue, the judge spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Miss Sterling, I've heard enough," Judge Thompson said. "I am issuing a temporary freeze on all of your assets until this case is resolved. Your business dealings, your properties, your investments, all of it will be put on hold. If you think you can walk away from this without consequences, I'm afraid you are sorely mistaken." The room fell silent. Ava's smirk faltered, and her face went pale. Her entire world had just been upended in a matter of seconds. "What?" she blurted out, standing abruptly. "You can't do that. I need my assets to run my businesses, my investors, my family. This is going to ruin everything." The judge raised a hand to silence her. "This is not about what you own, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about what you've lost, your humanity, your sense of responsibility. You cannot buy your way out of this." Ava felt her knees weaken as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. Her whole life, everything she had ever known, was slipping through her fingers. She was no longer untouchable. Jason watched her, his eyes hard. The woman who had never once shown him a shred of concern now seemed to be unraveling, her carefully crafted facade cracking before his eyes. For the first time, he felt a flicker of satisfaction, a sense of justice taking root. But there was no time to savor the moment. Jason's thoughts quickly turned to the consequences of this trial for him. The road to recovery was long, and even with the lawsuit in his favor, he wasn't sure what the future held. Ava might lose her wealth, but that didn't mean his life would suddenly go back to normal. Ava's realization. After the court session ended, Ava felt the weight of the judgment settle on her shoulders. She couldn't believe it. This was supposed to be a simple case, something she could brush off with a few phone calls to her lawyers, a quick settlement, and maybe a small fine. But now? Now, she was facing a full-scale financial freeze, an immediate halt on her assets, and, most terrifying of all, the reality that she wasn't invincible. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. The reporters swarmed her instantly, cameras flashing as they bombarded her with questions. "Miss Sterling, how do you feel about the ruling?" one reporter asked. "Are you worried about surviving without your wealth?" another chimed in. Ava shoved her way through the crowd, her bodyguard struggling to hold them back. She was desperate to get away, to retreat to her private world where nothing could touch her. She needed to fix this. Somehow. Her heart raced as she approached her black Rolls-Royce parked just outside. She threw open the door, slamming it shut behind her. "Drive!" she snapped at the chauffeur, her voice dripping with urgency. The driver hesitated before replying, "Miss Sterling, there's something I need to tell you." His tone was awkward, uncomfortably cautious. Ava turned to him, her face tight with impatience. "What is it?" "I've just received word, ma'am," the driver continued, shifting nervously, "that your accounts have already been frozen. Your staff has been let go. All your properties and vehicles are no longer accessible to you. The court order is already in effect." Ava's blood ran cold. "What?" The driver's voice faltered as he replied, "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. I have to leave now." Without another word, the driver stepped out of the car and walked away, leaving Ava alone in the back seat, her world spinning. Ava reached for her phone, dialing her father's number in a panic. But the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. No answer. She tried a third time, but there was still no response. Ava's stomach churned with a sickening realization. Her father had cut her off. She had nowhere to turn, no one to call. Ava Sterling, the once untouchable heiress, was stranded. completely alone. Ava sat in the back of her Rolls-Royce, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Her wealth, her power, her lifestyle, all of it had been ripped from her in a single moment. It was impossible to comprehend. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, above the law, and now everything she had worked so hard to maintain was slipping through her fingers. The realization hit her like a gut punch, but there was no escaping the truth. She was no longer in control. Ava threw open the door of the car and stepped out onto the curb, her mind spinning as the weight of the situation finally sank in. The reporters who had followed her earlier were now standing at a distance, their cameras aimed at her. She ignored them as she stormed past, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement, each step a painful reminder of the humiliation she was facing. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to reach anyone who might be able to help her. Her lawyer, her assistant, anyone. But each call went unanswered. Her father's phone, once her lifeline, went straight to voicemail. Ava's world was crumbling, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the brutal reality. She had no one to rely on. With a sigh of frustration, Ava walked down the street, her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair doing little to shield her from the cold, hard truth of her situation. She had spent years living in a bubble, surrounded by luxury, with everything handed to her on a silver platter. Now, she was just another woman, alone in the middle of New York City, with nothing left but her pride. Jason's life continues. Meanwhile, Jason Adams was at home, trying to make sense of his own reality. The trial had been a long, grueling process, but it had finally reached a turning point. The ruling had been made, and Ava's assets were frozen. But Jason knew the battle wasn't over. The road to recovery was long, and the outcome of the trial would not fix the damage already done. He sat at his kitchen table, the bills piling up in front of him, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to make ends meet. His leg was still healing, and he had been forced to sell his car just to cover medical expenses. Every time he thought about his daughter, Lily, his heart sank. She deserved so much better than this. She deserved a life free from worry. But here they were, living paycheck to paycheck, struggling just to put food on the table. Jason rubbed his eyes in frustration, wishing he could do more for Lily. He had always done everything he could to provide for her, but now, with no steady income, he wasn't sure how he would be able to keep up. The thought of her seeing him struggle made him feel like a failure as a father. Lily came into the room, her blonde curls bouncing as she walked up to him with a smile. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice sweet and innocent. Jason forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just a little tired, that's all." Lily looked at him with wide eyes, then asked, "Can we make cookies later?" Jason's heart swelled. Despite everything they were going through, Lily still had that spark in her eyes, that optimism that he had tried so hard to protect. He nodded. "Sure, we can make cookies. How about chocolate chip?" "Yay!" Lily cheered, running off to the kitchen. Jason watched her run off with a sigh. He loved her more than anything in the world, and the thought of her growing up in a world full of struggle and hardship weighed heavily on him. But despite it all, he would do whatever it took to protect her. Ava walked aimlessly down the street, her mind in turmoil. She had never known a life without money. Everything had always been easy for her, until now. Every corner she turned, every step she took, she was reminded of her vulnerability. Her bank accounts were frozen, her properties locked up, and she had no one left to turn to. For the first time, she felt small, insignificant. The luxury apartments, the expensive cars, the constant attention from the media. It had all been a facade. Without money, Ava was nothing. She had spent so much of her life building a world around her that now felt like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. She didn't know where to go. Her penthouse had been locked down, her staff had been fired, and she had no place to stay. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from her assistant. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. We've all been let go. Please take care of yourself." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had no one. She had always treated the people around her like tools, people to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful. And now, she was completely alone. Ava wandered the streets, her stomach growling with hunger. She had no money to buy food, and she couldn't bring herself to beg. The once immense power she had felt in every room she entered had evaporated. She was just another person on the streets, invisible to the world. She passed a run-down diner, the smell of greasy food wafting out from the door. Ava's stomach twisted in hunger, but she couldn't bring herself to walk inside. What was she supposed to do? Beg for food? For the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't above anyone. She wasn't special. She was just like everyone else, vulnerable and struggling to survive. Back in Jason's small apartment, things had taken a different turn. The trial was far from over, but Jason felt a small sense of victory. The judge's ruling was a step in the right direction, even though the road ahead was still uncertain. Jason knew that no matter what happened, he had stood up for himself and for the life he wanted to give Lily. Jason's lawyer had warned him that this was only the beginning, and Ava would try everything in her power to get out of the situation. But for now, Jason focused on the small victories, the fact that he had fought back, that he had been heard. Ava was no longer untouchable, and that gave Jason a sense of satisfaction. Jason glanced at the clock. It was time to get to work again. He had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it was. His leg might be healing, but the emotional wounds of the accident were still there. And yet, despite everything, he felt a quiet strength growing within him. Ava found herself standing on the corner of a busy New York street, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She stared blankly at the people walking by, their lives moving forward while hers seemed to be crumbling. She felt invisible, a sharp contrast to the woman she had once been. The powerful heiress to a global empire, always in control, always the center of attention. Now, she was just another face in the crowd, trying desperately to figure out how she had ended up here. Her phone was still silent, her calls unanswered. Every attempt to contact someone, her lawyer, her father, anyone, had been met with rejection. The once glamorous world she had inhabited seemed like a distant memory. Ava's mind was racing as she realized she had nothing left. She was alone, completely alone. With no other options, she wandered the streets aimlessly, passing by luxury stores, each one a reminder of the life she had lost. The glittering windows of designer boutiques mocked her as she walked past, a sharp contrast to the reality she was now living. No money, no staff, no help. For the first time in her life, Ava was faced with the harshness of survival. She tried to shake the thought away, focusing instead on finding a place to stay. But each step only seemed to drag her deeper into despair. She had never known a life like this, and the thought of being on her own, without the power she once wielded, terrified her. Ava had spent years building a world where everything was easy, where problems were solved with a simple check or a few phone calls. Now, those options were no longer available. Back at Jason's apartment, Life continued on. The bills still piled up, and his leg, though healing, still caused him pain. Yet, somehow, he felt a quiet strength within him that he hadn't felt before. Every day was a struggle, but it was a struggle he was willing to face. The accident had changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined, but now he was learning how to rebuild, bit by bit. Jason had always been a fighter, but he had never faced anything like this. With Ava's financial assets frozen and her influence crumbling, he knew he had a chance to make a difference. But the real work wasn't just about the trial. It was about rebuilding his own life, piece by piece, for his daughter. For Lily. He had no intention of letting his daughter see how much this was all affecting him. Lily was strong and smart, and Jason refused to let her see the struggles he was enduring. Each night, when he came home from his second job at a small repair shop, he made sure Lily had everything she needed, whether it was dinner, homework help, or just a story before bed. Jason watched his daughter in awe. Despite everything that had happened, she was still full of joy and energy, completely unaware of the struggles he faced. She still smiled at the little things, at the simple joy of drawing a picture or playing with her toys. For Lily, the world was still bright and full of possibilities. Jason smiled as he watched her from across the room. Despite all the pain and hardship, he knew he was doing the right thing. He was surviving. And, more importantly, he was showing Lily how to survive. As the hours passed, Ava's desperation grew. She couldn't ignore the gnawing hunger in her stomach, the aching loneliness that filled her chest. She tried to keep moving, walking aimlessly down the busy streets. But it didn't matter. Everywhere she looked, she was reminded of everything she had lost. The flashing lights of expensive restaurants, the luxury cars speeding past her, the sleek storefronts. None of it was hers anymore. At one point, her stomach growled loudly, and she paused in front of a small, run-down diner. The smell of frying food and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, making her stomach twist with hunger. She didn't have the money to eat at a fancy restaurant, nor did she have the pride to beg for food. She just wanted something to fill the emptiness. Ava hesitated outside the diner for a long time, staring at the cracked windows and faded sign. It was nothing like the places she used to frequent, nothing like the five-star dining experiences she had come to expect. But in that moment, it felt like the only option. Swallowing her pride, she stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and the warmth of the diner enveloped her. A few heads turned as she entered, but there were no reporters, no flashes from cameras. She was just another customer, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the center of attention. A waitress with graying hair and a friendly smile walked over to her. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked, her voice kind and unhurried. Ava stared at the menu, feeling completely out of place. She hadn't been in a diner like this in years, probably never, in fact. She scanned the cheap prices listed on the menu, but the food seemed foreign to her. She was used to gourmet meals, imported delicacies, and expensive wines. Now, she was looking at a simple, no-frills menu. "I'll have the special," she muttered, suddenly feeling embarrassed. The waitress nodded and moved away to place the order, and Ava sat back in the booth, staring at the empty table. She could hear the chatter of the other customers around her, the clinking of silverware, and the hum of the diner's old-fashioned jukebox. The simplicity of it all hit her like a wave. This was what it had come to. She had spent so much of her life looking down on people like these, people who worked hard for every dollar, who lived simple lives without the luxury of designer clothes or extravagant vacations. Now, she was one of them. The realization was humiliating, but it was also enlightening. While Ava sat in the diner, grappling with her new reality, Jason's day continued as usual. He finished his second job late that night and was heading back to his small apartment when something caught his eye across the street. He paused, his heart stopping for a moment. There, on the corner of the street, was Ava Sterling. She was standing by a newsstand, staring at her phone, looking lost and unsure of where to go. It was hard to believe. He had seen her on the covers of magazines, walking through luxury stores, and attending exclusive events. Now, here she was, out in the open, vulnerable and alone. Jason felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also something else. A sense of justice, maybe. Ava had lived her life with such indifference to the struggles of others, but seeing her now, in this state, made him realize that no one was immune to hardship. Even the most powerful could fall. He turned away, not wanting to get involved. He had enough on his plate without worrying about her. But as he walked down the street, he couldn't help but feel that, in some strange way, the playing field had been leveled. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the dirty window of her cheap motel room, Ava awoke to a reality that felt alien and uncomfortable. She had spent the night on a lumpy bed, in a room with cracked walls and a faint odor of mildew. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept in a place like this, if ever. Her body ached from the uncomfortable mattress, but more than the physical discomfort, it was the mental strain that kept her up through the night. She could still hear the sounds of the city buzzing outside her window. The honking cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the faint hum of a subway train. New York was alive, as it always was, and yet, for the first time, Ava felt utterly invisible. She had no money, no credit, no connections, and no way of getting out of this nightmare. After tossing and turning for a while, Ava eventually pulled herself out of bed and stumbled into the bathroom. Her reflection in the cracked mirror was a far cry from the glamorous woman she once saw every time she looked in the mirror. Her face was tired, her eyes hollow. The mascara from last night's breakdown was smudged under her eyes, and her hair, once perfectly styled, was now a mess of tangles. This was the reality she had to face now. There was no luxury, no escape. She took a deep breath, her pride still intact, but barely. It was time to figure something out. Ava found herself walking down the street in search of something, anything, to keep her going. As she passed a series of small businesses, she saw a "Help Wanted" sign hanging in the window of a rundown diner. Her stomach growled in protest, reminding her of her hunger. But this time, it wasn't just food she was desperate for. It was work. Her mind raced. Could she really do this? Could she, the woman who had spent years in luxury, ever bring herself to take a job like this? But the truth hit her hard. She had no other choice. Ava pushed the door open, a bell jingling overhead as she entered the diner. The smell of frying eggs and sizzling bacon immediately hit her, making her stomach growl louder. The diner was small, with cheap plastic booths and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It was nothing like the fine dining restaurants she used to frequent, but it was the only option she had. The waitress behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with curly hair, looked up as Ava walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice friendly but disinterested. Ava cleared her throat, feeling an unfamiliar sense of humility wash over her. "I saw your sign. I'm looking for work," she said, her voice shaky but determined. The waitress studied her for a moment before giving a half-hearted shrug. "We're short-staffed today, so if you're willing to start right now, you can help out," she said, tossing Ava a dirty apron. "Just don't make a scene, and keep up." Ava took the apron, trying to hold back the surge of embarrassment flooding her chest. She couldn't believe this was her reality now. But with no other choice, she tied the apron around her waist and stepped behind the counter. The waitress handed her a notepad and a pen. "You can start by taking orders. Let's see how you do." Ava nodded, swallowing her pride as she moved to the first table. The customers were a mix of tired, overworked businessmen, construction workers, and a few older folks enjoying a quiet breakfast. None of them looked up when she approached. She took their orders, coffee, eggs, toast, and repeated it back as best as she could. Her mind was still reeling, and every action felt clumsy and awkward. This wasn't the kind of life she was used to. She had never had to work like this, never had to sweat over something so mundane. As the morning passed, Ava began to settle into the rhythm. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even remotely close to what she had been used to. But it was real. And it was necessary. For the first time in a long while, Ava felt what it was like to rely on her own abilities. No PR team, no assistants to do her bidding, no adoring fans, just her, a dirty apron, and a notepad full of orders. Jason Adams, meanwhile, was going through his daily routine, balancing work, physical therapy, and taking care of Lily. Every day felt like a constant fight for survival, but it was a fight he was willing to endure. He was determined to rebuild his life and protect Lily at all costs. When he wasn't working his day job at the mechanic shop, he spent his evenings doing what he could to provide for his daughter. Every day was a struggle to make ends meet, but Jason never showed weakness in front of Lily. He was her knight in shining armor, even if that armor was worn and battered. Jason couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Ava Sterling had been the face of wealth and privilege, untouchable almost. He had always hated her arrogance, her dismissive attitude, her complete lack of empathy for people like him. But now, seeing her fall from grace, Jason didn't know how to feel. Part of him felt vindicated, but another part of him felt pity. He had seen her that day, wandering the streets, looking lost and helpless. Jason hadn't been able to bring himself to approach her. She had hurt him, and he wasn't sure he was ready to forgive her. But watching her struggle, something deep inside him stirred. He knew what it was like to be down and out, to feel helpless. Maybe, in some strange way, she was learning the same lesson. As the days passed, Ava's pride continued to wage war with her reality. Every day, she woke up in her small motel room, feeling the weight of her situation. She still couldn't fully accept it. Her mind constantly searched for an escape, for a way to get back to her former life. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back. The life she had built on wealth and status was gone, and all that was left was a fight for survival. At the diner, she worked harder each day, doing everything she could to keep her head down and avoid attention. The other waitresses and staff were kind enough, but it was clear they saw her as nothing more than another worker. They didn't know who she was, and it was almost a relief. The less attention she drew to herself, the better. Still, Ava couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that constantly gnawed at her. This wasn't the life she had chosen, but it was the life she now had to live. As the days turned into weeks, Ava Sterling found herself settling into a new routine. It wasn't glamorous, nor was it anything close to the high society lifestyle she had once known, but it was her reality now. Every morning, she woke up in the same dingy motel room, brushed her hair, and threw on the same dirty apron that had become her new uniform. The smell of frying eggs and hot coffee became as familiar to her as the scent of designer perfumes had once been. Ava had learned to stop looking at the life she had lost. She no longer compared the rattle of the old diner's windows to the sleek glass panels of her penthouse. There was no point in imagining herself back in her private jet or among the glamorous social circles she used to frequent. Instead, she focused on surviving. Her work at the diner, while far from her comfort zone, had slowly begun to feel less like punishment and more like an escape from the crushing weight of her past mistakes. She wasn't at the top anymore, but at least she was doing something real. At least she had earned each dollar she made. The other waitresses, who had initially seen her as nothing more than a wealthy woman in over her head, began to warm up to her. They shared tips on how to hustle through the breakfast rush, how to deal with rude customers, and what to do when a kid spilled their juice all over the counter. Ava, once so dismissive of the little people, found herself listening more and more, learning from the women who had worked at the diner for years. And surprisingly, it felt good. She wasn't alone in this new life. These women didn't care about her last name or the billions of dollars she had once inherited. They cared about getting through the day, about getting their paychecks, and making it to the next. Ava found herself gaining new skills, little by little. She learned how to wait tables without dropping trays, how to deal with grumpy customers without losing her temper, and, most surprisingly, how to laugh at herself. The vanity and arrogance that had once defined her were slowly beginning to fall away, replaced by a humbling kind of resilience. But as Ava found her footing in this new, humbling life, Jason Adams continued to fight his own battles. Despite his injuries and the mounting pressure of his financial struggles, he remained steady. Every day, he worked long hours at the mechanic shop, his hands calloused and stained with grease. Every evening, he came home to Lily, determined to make sure she felt safe and loved, no matter how hard their circumstances became. Jason had always been a quiet man, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than be the center of attention. His sense of pride had always come from knowing he was providing for his daughter, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. But now, with his leg still healing and his car gone, Jason faced a different kind of battle. The financial burden had grown, and every day he wondered how he was going to keep up. He tried not to let Lily see how hard it was, but there were moments, like when they sat together at dinner, looking at the stack of unpaid bills, that he couldn't hide the worry on his face. Despite all of it, Jason kept going. For Lily. One evening, after a long shift, Jason sat down on the couch in their small apartment, rubbing his leg where the bones still ached. His eyes were heavy, his body drained from the day's work, but there was something about the warmth of the apartment. The laughter from Lily as she watched TV, the familiar smell of food cooking, that made it all worth it. He knew that no matter how tough things got, he would always be there for her. That evening, as Jason helped Lily with her homework, he received a call from his lawyer. The news wasn't great. Despite the evidence, Ava's team was pushing hard for a settlement. She was trying to buy her way out of the situation, offering him money in exchange for dropping the case. Jason had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still stung. He sat silently for a moment, thinking about the offer. He could take the money, pay off the bills, fix the car, and maybe even get back on track. But that wasn't why he had filed the lawsuit in the first place. It wasn't about the money. It was about holding Ava accountable, about making sure that someone like her, someone who had always thought she could get away with everything, finally faced the consequences of her actions. As the phone call ended, Jason's mind returned to the moment he had seen Ava on the street. She had looked lost, vulnerable, and completely out of place. For a moment, Jason had felt pity for her, but the thought was fleeting. Ava had made her choices, and now she was learning the hard way. Jason couldn't help but feel a small sense of justice at the thought. But he also couldn't help wondering, could she change? Could someone like Ava really learn humility? One morning, as Ava was wiping down a table, She noticed a familiar face walk through the diner door. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw him. Jason Adams, the man she had injured, the man whose life she had ruined. He stood in the doorway, scanning the room as if he were looking for someone. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Jason walked toward the counter, his crutches tapping against the floor. Ava quickly turned away, pretending to focus on a menu she was wiping down. The last thing she wanted was for him to see the change in her, to see how much she had fallen. But Jason was already looking at her, his gaze steady and unreadable. He took a seat at the counter, and for a moment, Ava stood frozen in place. Her pulse raced as she forced herself to walk over to him. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. Jason looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read her. "Just coffee," he said quietly. "Black." Ava nodded and went to pour his coffee, her hands shaking. As she set the cup in front of him, she found herself staring at him. There was something different about him, something more grounded. He was no longer just the victim of the accident. He was a man who had been through a hell of a lot. And yet, he was still standing. Jason took a sip of his coffee and glanced at her again. "You look different," he said, his voice low. Ava bit her lip, unsure how to respond. "I guess I've changed," she muttered, not looking at him. Jason didn't say anything else for a while, just drank his coffee, but Ava could feel the weight of his gaze on her. It wasn't judgmental, just curious. Finally, Jason spoke again. "I never thought I'd see you in a place like this." Ava swallowed hard, her pride stinging at the admission. "Neither did I." Jason simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Then he leaned back in his seat, took another sip of coffee, and said, "I hope you're learning something from this." Ava nodded, but the words were stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could admit how much this new life had humbled her. Instead, she just turned away, knowing that the change in her was something she would have to prove to herself, not to anyone else. The days following that awkward encounter in the diner were filled with a quiet sense of change. But it wasn't just Ava who was shifting. Jason felt it too. The trial had been dragging on, and both sides were preparing for the final round. Ava had tried everything to settle out of court, offering Jason a large sum of money, hoping that it would make him drop the lawsuit. But Jason remained steadfast, unwilling to accept anything other than justice. Jason knew that Ava's arrogance, her dismissive attitude, would only work against her. Her pride had led her to this point, and it was the very thing that was making her crumble. For the first time in his life, Jason felt as though he was fighting not just for his own survival, but for something greater. He wasn't just fighting for his financial stability or to be compensated for his pain. He was fighting for something Ava had never considered: accountability. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing. The media was buzzing with excitement, hoping for another dramatic turn in the ongoing case. Ava Sterling had been the darling of New York society for years, but now she was fighting for her future in a way she had never imagined. She walked in, wearing a black dress, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. Her designer suit was still immaculate, but it felt out of place now. Gone was the aura of invincibility she once exuded. Now, she was just another person facing the consequences of her actions. Jason sat quietly in the front row, his hands clasped in his lap. His leg was still in a brace, but he had become stronger. He had learned to live without the things he once thought were essential. His world had shrunk down to the small apartment he shared with Lily, the constant struggle to keep things afloat. But at least he had dignity. At least he was still standing. Judge Harris, a no-nonsense man with a calm demeanor, took his seat on the bench. The courtroom fell silent as he tapped his gavel. "We are here today for the final ruling in the case of Jason Adams versus Ava Sterling," Judge Harris began, his voice steady. "Miss Sterling, you have attempted to settle this matter privately, but it seems that your actions have only compounded the damage. You have refused to accept responsibility for the accident that severely injured Mr. Adams, and you have tried to buy your way out of this. However, justice is not for sale." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, her stomach twisted with dread. She had braced herself for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the cold, indifferent judgment that was now coming her way. "Miss Sterling, I have seen many wealthy individuals attempt to evade the consequences of their actions by using their wealth as a shield. But I am here to tell you that this court will not allow your money to determine the outcome of this case. Today, you will face the consequences of your negligence." Ava's eyes flicked to Jason, but he remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The anger she had felt for him had slowly been replaced with something else, a faint sense of regret. She wasn't sure if she was ready to accept it, but she knew deep down that things were never going to be the same again. The judge continued, "You will no longer have access to your wealth. Your assets are to be frozen, and you will live without the privileges you've taken for granted. For the next 90 days, you will experience life as Mr. Adams has, without the comfort of money, the ease of luxury. You will understand what it means to live in his shoes." Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, and she stood up abruptly, her legs trembling. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll lose everything. My businesses, my reputation, everything I've worked for. You can't strip me of my life like this." But Judge Harris was unmoved. "It's not about your business, Miss Sterling. It's about your character. You have failed to show any remorse, and it is time for you to understand what it truly means to live in a world without privilege. For the next 90 days, you will be held accountable." Ava's mind spun as the judge's words echoed in her ears. She had been living her life for so long with the belief that money could solve any problem, that her name alone could shield her from the world. But in that moment, she realized how wrong she had been. She was going to have to face the real world, the one she had always avoided. After the ruling, Ava was led out of the courtroom in a daze. The shock was too much to process. She had lived a life of privilege for so long that the idea of living without her wealth seemed like a distant, impossible dream. But now, it was her reality. The days following the trial were a blur. Ava was cut off from everything: her bank accounts, her luxurious apartment, her high-end lifestyle. She was forced to rent a small, cheap apartment in a run-down part of the city. The first time she walked through the door, she felt the weight of her new life settle in her bones. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. It was a life of survival. For the next few weeks, Ava struggled to adapt. The simple tasks she had once taken for granted, like grocery shopping or doing her own laundry, became challenges she had never considered before. Every time she walked into the corner store, she was reminded of how much her life had changed. She had to stretch every dollar, count every cent, and make choices she would have never dreamed of. But amidst the struggle, something began to shift inside her. As she walked through the city streets, she noticed the people around her, the ones who had always been invisible in her eyes. The elderly man picking up cans from the street, the woman at the bus stop clutching a child's hand, the homeless people asking for spare change. They were no longer just background noise. They were real people, just like her. Ava's pride began to wear thin. The sharp, defensive walls she had built around herself slowly crumbled as she came face to face with the harshness of her new reality. For the first time in her life, she was learning what it truly meant to survive without relying on others or on money. Meanwhile, Jason watched from afar as Ava's life crumbled. He couldn't deny that a part of him felt a small, quiet satisfaction. He had fought for justice, and in the end, it seemed like Ava was finally getting the lesson she had never learned. But another part of him wondered if things would ever change for her. He had seen the shift in her that day in the diner, the small, quiet moments of humility she had shown when she no longer had the power to control everything around her. As Jason spent his days working at the mechanic shop and coming home to Lily, he realized that his own journey wasn't over either. He had spent so much of his life focused on surviving and getting by that he had never really stopped to think about what it meant to live. But now, with the trial behind him, he knew that the most important thing was not just survival. It was finding the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what. And for the first time, he felt hopeful. As the 90-day sentence passed, Ava found herself in a constant state of discomfort, but also of slow, undeniable change. The luxury she had been surrounded by for most of her life felt like a distant memory, like something she used to dream of but would never see again. And perhaps, in some ways, she had begun to accept that. It had been a difficult transition. Ava struggled with the simplest of tasks at first, cooking for herself, budgeting the small amount of money she had, and dealing with people on a level she had never had to before. She used to have a whole team of assistants and helpers to take care of things for her, but now she was doing it all herself. At first, she resented it. Every time she went to the local grocery store, the reality of her situation slapped her in the face. The cheap brands, the small portions, the constant calculation of how far she could stretch her last few dollars. It was all so foreign. She had never understood why people like Jason had to live this way, but now she was living it, and it was both humiliating and eye-opening. It wasn't just the financial struggle. Ava had spent years surrounded by people who praised her, who told her she was brilliant and beautiful and deserving of everything she had. She had never truly worked for anything. The concept of working to earn a living had always seemed like something out of a far-off reality. But now she understood. She got a part-time job at a small boutique, organizing clothes and ringing up customers. The work was exhausting, but she began to find satisfaction in it. She wasn't proud of it, but she could see that it was honest. And, in a strange way, it felt good. She felt a sense of independence she had never known before, but it was far from easy. One afternoon, after her shift at the boutique, she found herself walking through the same streets, where, just months ago, she had lived in luxury. The familiar skyline of New York loomed ahead of her, but this time she didn't feel like she was above it all. She was a part of it, but not in the way she had once imagined. She wasn't better than anyone else anymore. Ava's thoughts were interrupted when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A familiar figure leaning against a streetlight. Jason. For a moment, their eyes met, and neither of them moved. Ava felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also something else she hadn't expected. A grudging respect. Jason had seen her fall. He had witnessed the collapse of everything she had ever known. And yet, he hadn't gloated, hadn't come to rub her face in her downfall. He had simply continued with his life, with his quiet strength and determination. Jason gave her a small nod, acknowledging her presence, but saying nothing. Ava stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, what to say. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people who had gone through something unimaginable, and somehow, without either of them expecting it, had become different because of it. Ava hesitated, but then spoke softly, her voice almost unrecognizable to herself. "Thank you." Jason raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but his voice was steady. "For what?" For not making this harder than it already is," she said, her gaze shifting to the ground. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." Jason didn't say anything for a long time. Then, with a slight smile, he shrugged. "People change, Miss Sterling. Sometimes it takes a fall to realize that." Ava nodded, feeling something stir inside her, an understanding she had never had before. She didn't know what the future held for her, but she knew one thing. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom months ago. Meanwhile, Jason was still working hard, trying to balance everything he could. He had taken on a second job to make ends meet, but there was still a sense of quiet satisfaction in him. His relationship with Lily had only grown stronger, and every day he was reminded of the importance of being present for her. Though the financial strain hadn't eased, and his body still ached from the accident, Jason felt a sense of pride in the way he had managed to adapt. There had been no grand revelation or dramatic change in his life, but little by little he had found a new sense of purpose. The same purpose that had led him to stand in that courtroom fighting for justice now carried him through the everyday struggles. It was in the small moments, the laugh he shared with Lily, the feeling of accomplishment when he finally fixed an engine that had been giving him trouble, the satisfaction of sitting down to a meal with his daughter after a long day, that he found his strength. And despite the chaos, despite the uncertainty, Jason felt confident that things would get better. Slowly, but surely. Ava sat at her small kitchen table one evening, staring out the window of her cramped apartment. The view wasn't much, just a few buildings across the street. But it was peaceful. She wasn't used to peacefulness. The sound of her phone buzzing on the table broke her reverie. She looked down at it, seeing a message from her lawyer. "Your assets have been reinstated, Miss Sterling. Your case has been settled." Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this moment for months now, ever since her sentence had started. But now, in this moment, the idea of returning to her old life seemed strange. She looked at her phone, at the offer that would restore everything, her wealth, her business, her reputation, but something inside her resisted. She had learned too much. She thought back to the diner, to the long shifts at the boutique, to the quiet, humbling days of working for every cent. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it had taught her something she hadn't known before. She had a sense of independence now, something she had never had before. Ava typed a response to her lawyer, her fingers shaking slightly. "I don't need my assets reinstated. I'm done." It felt strange, but also liberating. Ava didn't need her wealth to define her anymore. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to be someone else to be happy. The life she had once lived felt like a dream now, something she could barely remember. But the woman she was becoming was real, and that was enough. The next day, Ava stood outside the courthouse again, staring up at the familiar building. This time, she wasn't waiting for a ruling. She wasn't there for any legal matters. Instead, she was there to make a decision about the future. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. Jason. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. Jason caught up to her and nodded. "What now?" Ava smiled softly, the weight of everything she had been through settling into her bones. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to figure it out. On my own." Jason watched her for a long moment, then nodded in agreement. "You've got this." And for the first time in a long time, Ava believed it. 3 months had passed since the judge's ruling, and Ava Sterling stood at the crossroads of her life. The city around her buzzed with its usual energy, the streets crowded with people rushing to and from their destinations. But Ava's world felt different now. For once, it wasn't just about what she owned or what she could buy. It was about who she was and who she was becoming. She had spent the past 3 months adjusting to a life she had never imagined for herself, one without the comforts of wealth and privilege. The boutique job had become her anchor, not just for the steady paycheck, but for the lesson it had given her. Every day she worked, Ava learned something new. She learned about patience, hard work, and resilience. She learned about the people she had once ignored, the ones who worked tirelessly to make ends meet, who didn't have the luxury of throwing money at every problem. But it wasn't just the job that had changed her. The process of living without her wealth had forced Ava to confront the parts of herself she had long ignored, the parts that had made her feel entitled, that had caused her to look down on others. Her fall from grace had been painful, but it had been transformative. She had learned humility in a way that money could never teach. And now, as she walked through the streets of New York City, her city, but no longer the one she controlled, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Jason Adams, too, had changed. While Ava had been learning the lessons of humility and survival, Jason had been learning the lessons of strength and perseverance. His days were still filled with hard work. He had taken on additional shifts at the mechanic shop and was slowly rebuilding his life, one step at a time. The physical pain from his injury still lingered, but it was nothing compared to the emotional strength he had gained over the past few months. He had watched Ava's transformation from a distance, and in some ways, it had inspired him. The woman who had once seemed like an untouchable force in his life was now fighting her own battles. He saw the quiet pride in her as she worked at the boutique, the dignity she carried despite the hardships she faced. It wasn't the Ava he had once known, but perhaps it was the Ava she had always been meant to be. Jason's focus, however, had remained on Lily. Every decision he made, every step he took, was to ensure that she had a better life. And while the struggle was still there was a newfound sense of hope in his heart. He was no longer just surviving. He was building a future for himself and for Lily, brick by brick. One evening, after a long shift at the mechanic shop, Jason found himself standing in front of the small apartment he called home. He'd come a long way from the man who had first seen Ava in court. Angry and frustrated, a victim of circumstance. Now, he felt something different. His life wasn't perfect, and he still had a long way to go, but he felt stronger, more in control. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed Ava standing across the street, looking up at the skyline. She seemed lost in thought, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. Jason hesitated for a moment, then crossed the street, stopping just a few feet away from her. Ava turned and saw him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and neither of them spoke. There was so much between them, the history, the pain, the shared struggle. But there was something else now, too, a kind of understanding, born out of time and experience. "You're doing well," Jason said quietly, breaking the silence. Ava nodded slowly, her voice soft. "I think so." Jason smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. "Good to see you on your feet." "Yeah," Ava replied. "I'm learning how to stay there." They stood together for a moment, the noise of the city swirling around them. It was strange, this place they had found themselves in. They were both so different now, no longer the people they had once been. And yet, in some way, They were both stronger for it. After a long pause, Ava spoke again, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "Thank you. For everything." Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded. "You don't have to thank me. You did it yourself." Ava looked at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I guess I did, didn't I?" Jason laughed softly, shaking his head. "You've come a long way." Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, really living, and embracing the lessons life had taught her. And in some small way, she felt grateful for it. "So, what now?" Ava asked, glancing around at the city that had once been hers to command. Jason looked at her thoughtfully. "Now, we move forward, one day at a time." Ava nodded, the weight of her past no longer holding her back. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to run from it. She had learned from it, and it had shaped her into someone stronger. As they stood there side by side, Jason turned to her with a final quiet smile. "You've got this, Ava." Ava met his gaze, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "Yeah, I think I do." The city stretched out before them, a never-ending sea of lights and possibilities. And as Ava and Jason stood together, there was no clear answer to what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, they both felt something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Ava was no longer defined by the wealth she had once relied on, and Jason was no longer weighed down by the injustices of the past. They had both grown, in their own ways, into something new, something better. And though their paths might not always be smooth, and though life would continue to challenge them, they knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they were ready.